The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing my time with my colleague from Saint-Lambert. Mr. Speaker, the situation in Syria, we all know, is tragic. Let's first talk about the 70,000 deaths in that country. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend my sympathies to the families and relatives of those 70,000 dead. There are also survivors, Mr. Speaker, survivors who are suffering terribly. Mr. Speaker, over the past few months, there's been a massive influx of refugees into neighboring countries, whether it be Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, or Egypt. In January 2013, the High Commissioner for Refugees counted 500,000 refugees. That was 500,000 refugees. That's already a high number. Now, 4 small months later, there are 1.3 million refugees in neighboring countries. And some believe that could increase because there have been delays in registering these refugees. Therefore, there could be many more than we think. Out of that 1.3 million refugees, Mr. Speaker, 50% are children. More than 500,000 children are living in refugee camps in very, very difficult circumstances. That's putting enormous pressure on neighboring countries, Mr. Speaker. Let's just take Lebanon, for example. Lebanon might have 1.2 million refugees by the end of the year. That's absolutely terrible, Mr. Speaker. We have Lebanon, Egypt, and all the other countries, neighboring countries, who are doing what they can to deal with this, but they can't do it alone, Mr. Speaker. Nobody can do it alone. Let's take Lebanon again. In Canada, it would be as if all of a sudden Canada were to receive 3 million refugees. That's the situation in Lebanon. Canada, a developed country, would have a very, very difficult time in receiving an influx of 3 million refugees, Mr. Speaker. So we know that neighboring countries are facing enormous and insurmountable challenges. And they certainly can't surmount those challenges without assistance from the international community. That's not all, Mr. Speaker. There are refugees outside the country, outside Syria, but there are also internally displaced persons within Syria. 4 million displaced persons inside Syria, Mr. Speaker, and half of those displaced persons are children. So we have 4 million displaced persons in Syria and another 2.8 million who urgently need humanitarian assistance. Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, I was in New York and I met with the representatives from the United Nations Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance, and they spoke to me about the lack of medication. They spoke to me about water systems that have been completely destroyed, water treatment systems that have been completely destroyed, schools that no longer exist, children in Aleppo that haven't been to school for 1 or 2 years now. So the country is collapsing in ruins, Mr. Speaker. So they're facing huge needs. And if there is no increase, if there isn't a massive increase in international assistance and in international humanitarian assistance, the consequences could be disastrous. They could be catastrophic. The needs exist now. Already there are epidemics starting, and with the summer these epidemics will only become worse. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations needs to be able to work with refugees outside Syria and with internally displaced persons in Syria, and therefore they need $1.6 billion for humanitarian assistance. But there's only been a commitment for about a half of that. Mr. Speaker,
I would like to lend my voice to Stephen Cornish, the Executive Director of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, who wrote an excellent article recently. And he was saying, and I'm going to quote him lengthily, where he was saying, "We are failing the Syrian people. Right now, women, men, and children are suffering and dying needlessly. We can and must do more to help them." I recently returned from a 2-week mission to Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. There I met with Syrians struggling to survive a brutal civil war that has so far killed more than 70,000 people and forced more than 1.5 million to flee to neighboring countries. I also met with aid workers providing life-saving assistance from my own organization, Médecins Sans Frontières, and from the few other present. One thing became absolutely clear to me on this trip. We, the international community, are not living up to our responsibility to meet the escalating humanitarian needs of people caught up in this intractable war. Truly, we are failing the Syrian people. Il mentionne également les blessures, the medical needs that are overwhelming, from shrapnel injuries that go untreated for lack of accessible care, to pregnant women who must risk their lives to deliver their babies, to sufferers of chronic illnesses like diabetes and cancer who can't obtain treatment, to the miserable and unsanitary conditions of the camps for displaced people. The conflict in Syria shows no sign of abating, and the needs of the Syrian people are increasing daily. There is no excuse for our continued humanitarian failure. We must act now. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, I fully endorse those comments, as well as what Mr. Cornish said about this not simply being a question of money. We also have to persuade Damascus and opposition groups to allow humanitarian assistance so that they can deliver those services that are so badly needed. We also have to support neighboring countries and make it easier for them to do their work and for humanitarian workers to do their work in neighboring countries. So we need to work on measures that will help and encourage people working in the field, and that will encourage those out in the field to respect international humanitarian assistance. Money is key, however, because, of course, in order to be able to have humanitarian workers, you have to have the money to be able to send them there. Canada has made some effort in that area. However, it's a very small effort. The Minister of International Development has been sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars. We know that hundreds of projects could be supported by CEDA, but in any case, there are hundreds of millions of dollars sitting there. Could they not have been used? Could a little of that money not have been used to help deal with this enormous humanitarian crisis? Because the money is there, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt about that. So there is no excuse for lack of action. Syrians, their neighbors, and the international community expect no less of us, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Comments, the Honourable Parliament Secretary for International Cooperation.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, Canada has been a very generous donor. We are the 5th largest donor and the 5th largest per capita. So To date, we have contributed $48.5 million to help with the humanitarian situation in Syria, and we continue to assess the situation, and we'll do more as the needs grow. But we do call on all funders to pay what they pledge, and we would like to see all of those contributions that have been targeted for the Syrian conflict brought to the table so that the humanitarian efforts can be made. But I would personally like to say thank you very much to all of the Canadians whose hard-earned tax dollars we are spending to help in the humanitarian assistance, and I wonder if my colleague wouldn't like to do the same.
Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And, of course, I would like to thank all Canadians, whether it be through their taxes or voluntary contributions, have stood up and wanted to do something about this situation. Now, the Parliamentary Secretary said that Canada contributes and increases contributions as those needs increase, but since January, the number of refugees has tripled, Mr. Speaker, and to my knowledge, Canada has not actually reconsidered its contributions since January. So I don't think that what is being said quite reflects the reality, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm not saying that the $48.5 million aren't a good thing. Yes, they are. However, the British government is also in a very difficult economic situation, and it has provided about 5 times more, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saint-Laurent-Cartierville. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her comments. She has provided some shocking numbers that show there's been an increase in refugees, and there are neighboring countries. There's Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And Canada has to do what it can to help those countries, because if the whole region were to become destabilized, that would have terrible consequences. The most fragile country there is Lebanon. The Prime Minister hasn't been replaced yet. We don't know when that will happen. And it's a very difficult situation to control. I would have liked to be able to put these questions to the government, but I'm going to put the question to my colleague because she's very aware of the situation. What are Canada's contacts in Lebanon? Who is Canada talking to? And how will we be able to make sure that we can help that country deal with what's happening in Syria? The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his excellent question and the excellent points that he has raised, especially in terms of the destabilization of the region. In Lebanon, 10% of the people will actually be refugees from Syria. And so, yes, Lebanon is a fragile country. And these refugees are going into local communities, yes, and into some families. But the burden, the economic burden and the social burden is enormous for Lebanon. And that will be another destabilizing factor in that country. So when we're talking about humanitarian assistance, sometimes one is trying to resolve urgent issues. However, one also has to work on the level of prevention. So we're contributing a little to avoid destabilization, but we need to do more to avoid that destabilization of the whole region. Now, who are we talking to in Lebanon? Well, unfortunately, we're not in the government. I don't know who they're talking to. The government always says loud and clear what it's doing, but we don't actually get the impression they're sitting down and rolling up their shirt sleeve to get to work and resolve some of these issues, Mr. Speaker. Resuming debate, the Honourable